On April 30, 1975, a violent peace engulfed Vietnam. With North Vietnamese tanks reaching the presidential palace in Saigon, North Vietnam had reached its goal of Vietnamese reunification under communism. More than 1 million South Vietnamese tried to escape communism by the sea, and many died. Tens of thousands were killed, and many were imprisoned in gulags. In neighboring Cambodia, the situation was similar, with Pol Pot's communists taking power and beginning a reign of terror which would lead to 2 million dead out of 7 million. For Americans, symbolized by the embassy evacuation, it was humiliation. Its ally fell, and communism triumphed. American confidence and its prestige abroad were weakened, as well as national cohesion after years of poor war management. It's a particularly complex and controversial war, with a major difference between popular perception and reality. I'll tackle many myths, including the idea that Ho Chi Minh was an authentic nationalist, while Diem and Thieu were corrupt, incompetent dictators, that South Vietnam was an artificial creation destined to fall, that the NLF, the Viet Cong, embodied a popular revolution and that the Americans were intruding, that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a lie, that the domino theory was wrong, that the United States were beaten by a guerrilla made up of farmers, that General Westmoreland was incompetent, that General Giap defeated both France and the US, that the bombings on Cambodia by Kissinger and Nixon massacred innocents for nothing, that American bombings in general targeted civilians, or that the war was unwinnable. I'll basically defend the American and Allied intervention in Vietnam and show you how mistakes on both sides ended up in the result we all know. Many works about it tend to specialize on one aspect, but basing themselves on the same few reference works written by a handful of journalists like Stanley Carno, Neil Sheehan, and David Halberstam, who were honestly very biased and without ever questioning their conclusions. Here I'll be going against these authors and against historians such as Fredrik Logevall, who said that the war had been at best a mistake, at worst a crime. On the ground, American forces consistently beat North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. At the end, North Vietnam came out the winner. Why? Let's talk about it. And lastly, this video is about the period before a direct US intervention in 1965. Most videos about the war talk very quickly about it and concentrate on the 1965 to 68 period, but it's a little bit like beginning Lord of the Rings here and saying, okay, so they got the bad guy's ring and they gotta destroy it. It looks cool, but you don't really get what's going on. Vietnamese history is interesting because most of it wasn't fighting against invaders, China or Cambodia, but mostly civil wars. Contrarily to what we often hear, Vietnam and China rarely went into war. In 2,700 years, Vietnam has been unified only from 1802 to 1859. It was often divided into 3 regions, and for a long time in a similar pattern to the 1954 division, which is ironic. The country was colonized in 1884 by France, which divided it into 3 regions and merged it with Cambodia and Laos in 1888 to create Indochina. During the colonial period, there had been improvement for people in health, education and infrastructure, but everything was targeted for exploiting resources, mostly latex, and the local population remained marginalized and hierarchized. Many Vietnamese collaborated, but others defied the occupiers like Phan Dinh Phung, Phan Boi Cho, and Ho Chi Minh. 2 main opposition groups emerged in the 1920s and tried to kick France out in the 1930s. The Vietnamese Nationalist Party tried to create mutinies in the local army, but was targeted and kicked out in China. The other one was the Communist Party led by Ho Chi Minh. In 1930, it initiated an insurgency which seized a few provinces in the north before getting beaten by the French. The French as well as moderate Vietnamese were outraged by the violence of the insurgencies and turned to the new Emperor Bao Dai to repair relations. Bao Dai wanted to name as the Interior Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, who had a reputation for integrity and at the time respected even by the communists. Diem accepted the request in 1933, but after a few months in which it was clear the French would not delegate power, he resigned. Bao Dai had no real authority, so he began a passive life in luxury. This lasted until 1940, when Japan occupied Vietnam until directly taking control in March 1945. It severely damaged French colonial authority, especially since France had been snubbed by its allies. The Americans had an anti-colonial posture, the British wanted nothing to do with Vichy France, and Chiang Kai-shek wanted to establish a China-affiliated regime. The group best placed to profit from this was the Viet Minh, the new nationalist coalition dominated by Ho Chi Minh's communists. The Americans needed agents on the spot, the Viet Minh needed support, and the Japanese didn't oppose anti-French groups. With the Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, it was chaos, and Ho immediately took advantage of it to seize areas and get weapons. He talked about independence but not communism, which helped rally populations. He was helped by his charismatic personality and his demonstration of strength. Historically, Vietnamese people support the leader who shows the most strength, partly by reverence to authority, and partly by fear of reprisal by the winner. Not knowing that the United States accepted the French return to Indochina, Ho actively tried to seduce the Americans. He made his speech at the Place Pugier and he said to OSS agents that he wasn't really a communist but foremost a nationalist. The presence of OSS agents and American airplanes during the speech convinced the people that he was the winning side. His rivals, including Bao Dai, were impressed and decided to step aside. In arrangements regarding Japan's surrender, the British were to occupy southern Vietnam and Chinese nationalists the north. The French had other plans and landed in Saigon on August 23. Fighting immediately erupted with the Vietnamese, and French troops made quick progress. The Chinese refused to give their place and allowed Ho's government to consolidate and even sold them captured Japanese weapons. The Viet Minh was thus strong in the north but not in the south. There's a controversy around Ho Chi Minh as to whether he was a nationalist first or communist first, but honestly it's not worth the controversy and you'll see why. Those who say he was really a nationalist give two main arguments. The first was that in 1919 Ho wanted to meet US President Wilson to talk about decolonization, that he couldn't see him, and then rallied to communist countries. The second one mostly comes from OSS agents' perception. Ho had adapted his Place Pugier speech in 1945 for the Americans, with references to the Declaration of Independence, and said he wanted independence without ideology. On the other side now, Ho left Vietnam in 1912 to settle in Paris. He became involved in the French socialist movement, said he was a communist after reading Lenin, and co-founded the French Communist Party in 1920. He firmly embraced the principle for which communist nations should subordinate to the international communist movement, and even criticized Tito in 1940 for deviating from the Soviet line. Ho left for Moscow in 1923 to work for the Comintern, the Soviet organization for promoting revolution abroad. With Lenin's death, he wrote that Asian people saw in him a father. In 1924, he moved to Canton in China to establish a Vietnamese communist group. In accordance to Leninist theories, which talked about allying with the local bourgeois to remove the colonial powers before rebelling against the bourgeois, Ho allied with nationalist groups. He said that the League of Nations was counter-revolutionary. He was then sent by the Comintern to Siam, to Malaya, and to Singapore to inaugurate local communist parties. Moscow also put him in charge of revolutionary activities in Laos and Cambodia, leading to the creation of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. In 1930, he started an insurgency which seized several provinces in the north. Several landowners were executed and the land distributed to farmers. After his failure, Ho was imprisoned in Hong Kong. As Viet Minh leader against the French, he followed Chinese communist advice like orders. He got back to Vietnam in 1941 to establish a communist movement and established an HQ in a cave in the mountain he baptized Karl Marx. Near a river he baptized Lenin. It was there he founded the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh Hoi, or League for the Independence of Vietnam, abbreviated Viet Minh. Contrarily to Westerners who thought the Viet Minh was a nationalist coalition, it really was under communist leadership. Rival groups were slowly eliminated, often by assassination, until 1946. Even in the communist movement, because Stalin was the respected figure, Trotskyists like Tuan Tu An were persecuted. Ho called the American OSS for support and received weapons in exchange for promising to fight the Japanese. The Viet Minh though mostly stayed on the side. Its commanders wanted a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese, but Ho wanted to wait until favorable conditions. During the Indochina War, Viet Minh officers who were military competent but ideologically unsure were replaced. His government in 1955 violently imposed agricultural collectivization, leading to revolts and thousands of deaths in repression. I'm sparing you the details here, but we can agree that Ho Chi Minh was a staunch communist and only used nationalism to get rid of France. In villages in the north, the Viet Minh began executing thousands of people. As we saw, there remained non-communist nationalist groups, and the Viet Minh began a war against them in 1946. It didn't manage to eliminate opposition in the south. The situation was more chaotic, with many factions trying to gain followers. France came back in 1945 and quickly occupied the southern part of the country. In March 1946, Ho signed an agreement to allow French troops in the north, provided that his People's Republic was recognized as a free state in the French Union. He knew he couldn't win a war at that time. With negotiations deteriorating, he prepared for a war by doubling his army from 30 to 60,000. Both sides wanted complete control of the country and saw the status quo as temporary. Around this time, the Cold War began. The Cold War was a confrontation of power and ideology, with communist powers calling for overthrowing capitalist governments and expanding communism. As the Soviet Union captured territories in its victory in World War II, it established communist governments, most often by force, and against agreements with the Allies. Some said that the USSR only wanted a buffer zone for its security and that the Americans reacted too strongly and provoked the Cold War, but right since the beginning, the Soviets imposed communist institutions. Early confrontations happened in Greece, Turkey, and Iran. Beginning in 1947, there really was a US-USSR confrontation. Truman announced a containment doctrine to limit communist expansion. The main line of separation between the two blocs was in Europe, especially in Germany. There was in Europe a military gap, with 60 Soviet divisions in Eastern Europe against 6 American and British divisions in Western Europe. The Berlin Crisis happened in 1948 and 1949 when the Soviets wanted to cut Western access to Berlin. NATO was created in 1949 as a defense coalition. The Communist bloc expanded the same year with Mao's victory in the Chinese Civil War, and we soon after saw the first real war of the conflict. In 1950, North Korea, armed and trained by the Soviets, invaded the South. The Americans intervened under a UN mandate, and China intervened at the end of the year. It was a crucial event which made the United States react, giving them the impression of a united communist bloc, but priority remained in Europe. The Americans never wanted to commit too much forces in Asia. The coming of nuclear weapons worsened relations, and we arrived after a few years with a nuclear confrontation. Negotiations between France and the Viet Minh collapsed, leading to the beginning of the Indochina War when the communists struck on December 19, 1946. France reacted by force and quickly expelled the Viet Minh from Hanoi and from provincial capitals. The communists led the war against the French from the jungles in the next 8 years. They based themselves in the Viet Bac, an area hard to access, to base their operations. During the first years, the Viet Minh suffered defeat after defeat because of its lack of capabilities and military knowledge. Combat was mostly limited to the north, with the guerrilla operating against isolated outposts. In the south, the Viet Minh was too weak, and the French used help from religious groups such as the Cao Dai, Hoa Hao, as well as the criminal organization Bin Suen. The Cao Dai group, by the way, revered notably Buddha, Jesus, Victor Hugo, and Charlie Chaplin. The Hoa Hao was founded by a man who said he had magical powers. The Viet Minh feared his popularity, captured him, cut his body in pieces, and spread them across the country to avoid followers doing a pilgrimage. The Hoa Hao became the most anti-communist group. The French saw the war would be long and asked Emperor Bao Dai for help. He agreed in 1949 to establish an autonomous anti-communist regime in the French Union with its own army and finances. The turning point came with the communist takeover of China in 1949. Stalin and Mao wanted to use China as a springboard to communize the region. There was now a communist power neighbor in Vietnam which could infiltrate material. The Chinese often participated in the war in skirmishes, transporting material far into Vietnam, and serving as crew for artillery. The Viet Minh received light and heavy weapons, as well as 281 military experts like General Chang Gang. The Vietnamese communists saw the Chinese Revolution as a model to follow without question. They also followed the Chinese policy for land distribution by killing landowners and sometimes peasants when the landowner quota wasn't reached. Ho was conscious of these problems but didn't yet question the Chinese. The communists severely punished those who collaborated with the French, often by drowning, but their signature execution was disembowelment. We can take the example of Lam Quang Pong, who joined the Viet Minh right after the declaration of war in 1946. With his exploits, he became a war hero and had a bounty on his head by France. But because he refused to join the Communist Party and because of his growing fame, the Viet Minh tried to get rid of him. During an operation, he was ambushed by special units before escaping and being sued for treason and condemned to death by a people's tribunal. He owed his life to the intervention of his men's mothers, who demonstrated to prevent this. After the war, he rallied the South Vietnamese army. Up to that point, the United States weren't involved in the conflict as they didn't want to support the colonial system. Communization of China pushed them to give more importance to East Asia. They feared the domino theory, which was honestly credible, as we'll see. The communist victory in China led to the Sino-Viet Minh alliance, insurrections in Malaya, Burma, and Indonesia, as well as the revival of a communist insurgency in the Philippines. Contrarily to critics, those who believe in the domino theory didn't say the dominoes would fall uniformly, but rather that many governments would be intimidated and would ally with the communists. For France, the Indochina War was a faraway conflict, unlike Algeria, which would be more important. It was hard for the French army to juggle with a never-ending work, a distrustful population, a constant threat from guerrillas, and an indifferent France. At the end of the 1950s, the Viet Minh defeated several French garrisons at the Chinese border. The situation was getting worse before General Delattre de Tassigny was sent to take command. He reinvigorated the military effort, notably by creating a large local army. In early 1951, Viet Minh human wave attacks were defeated by French firepower. Strategic routes to the north were gained, but Delattre had to leave at the end of the year because of cancer. The 150,000 foreign soldiers focused on large Viet Minh units, but France was getting tired of the conflict. With Delattre's death in 1952, General Salan took charge and would be replaced by General Navarre in 1953. At this point, the United States provided lots of military equipment to France and paid up to half the war's cost in 1953. France told them it was a war against communism, but the Americans said, okay, then guarantee it'll give independence to Indochinese countries after the war. General Diap, commanding Viet Minh forces, also received a lot of military supplies and tried incursions into Laos in April 1953. After the failure of the Laos invasion by the Viet Minh, the communists were on the brink of collapse. Resources were lacking, people refused to join the movement, and troop morale was low. Navarre tried to intercept future Laos incursions by establishing a base in Dien Bien Phu in the north. It was an isolated base only supplied by air. It was an audacious gamble, and he sent 7,000 combat troops as well as 3,800 mixed nationality support troops to hold it. The Viet Minh decided to take it and deal a stunning blow by sending 50,000 men. The Chinese were still supplying up to 4,000 tons of aid per month. The Viet Minh requisitioned civilians to carry materials in the jungle, and many died, and managed to reach Dien Bien Phu with heavy weapons. Intense artillery bombardments and assaults took down the outposts, but at great cost. Ho Chi Minh thought the situation desperate and asked for a direct Chinese intervention. There was debate in the US as to whether it should intervene as the French situation worsened. It thought of sending bombers to attack communist formation around the base, but Eisenhower didn't want to intervene without an international coalition. With massive infantry assaults and after losing 22,900 men, the Viet Minh managed to take the base on May 7, 1954. It wasn't a real military blow to France, but a blow to its prestige. The war was already controversial at home, so Paris decided to end it. One of the reasons for the French failure was refusing to establish a strong state in the south and a strong national army. At the peak of the war in 1953, the Viet Minh had 6 full divisions, 420,000 men including guerrillas, while the Vietnamese army only had 45 battalions, less than 200,000 men. On July 21, the Geneva Accord was signed by France, the Viet Minh, and several other countries for establishing 2 separate Vietnams divided at the 17th parallel. This ironically was similar to the way the country was divided by the Nguyen dynasty several centuries ago. Bao Dai would lead South Vietnam with its 11 million people, while the Viet Minh would lead the North with its 14 million. Reunification elections were set up for 1956, and a commission which included India, Poland, and Canada would watch over implementing the accord. Contrarily to popular belief, the Viet Minh wasn't forced by China and the USSR to accept division. It saw the accord as a way to gain time to rebuild its strength. It's important to note that neither South Vietnam nor the United States has signed the accord. South Vietnam's history is really interesting. There were 4 phases: Bao Dai State, Diem's First Republic, 4 years of transition, and finally Thieu's Second Republic. It was an independent country, just like South Korea, and many decisions made in Hanoi and Washington were in reaction to events in South Vietnam, which we tend to forget. During the war and after its downfall, South Vietnam has been judged as a stereotypical kleptocracy. The message we often hear is that Hanoi was a vessel of Vietnamese nationalism, while Saigon was destined to fall. The South Vietnamese, however, had dreams of freedom, independence, and development. South Vietnam wasn't an American artificial creation, and the Second Republic wasn't a dictatorship like the first. Democracy is always work in progress, especially in times of war. Most Vietnamese leaders adopt a strongman style. Repressive regimes, however, are unacceptable for the West. There was 4 lines of conflict among South Vietnamese nationalists: political, religious, regional, and ethnic. Sadly, I won't go over them in detail, this video is long enough. In the country, the most powerful group was the military. It was the most well-established nationalist element, but was also beset by factionalism, notably between officers born in the north or south, or between Buddhists and Catholics. For religions, Buddhism was the most important. Of a population of 12 million at that point, 3 to 4 million were Buddhists, half of them practicing, 3 to 4 million were Confucians, 1.5 million were Catholics, and 2 million more belonged to the Cao Dai and Oahu sects. Shortly before the Geneva Accords in July 1954, Bao Dai named Ngo Diem Prime Minister. Diem is often remembered as a tyrant who wasn't better than the communists, but the reality was more complex. Diem was a man whose faults, notably his dependence on his controversial brothers, would cast a shadow on his qualities and lead to his fall. In 1933, as I said, he resigned from the government when he realized France was still calling the shots. Ho Chi Minh then exiled him in 1945 to a Chinese village where he almost died of malaria. After 6 months, Ho offered him a post as minister, but Diem refused and was released. That was a big mistake for the communists. He left for the United States in 1950 before being called back in 1954. He could show impressive leadership, was a devout Catholic, anti-colonialist, anti-communist, incorruptible, hardworking, and devoted to Vietnam. During the First Republic, he managed by will, courage, and his monastic style that people love to establish a viable, unified country. His political and economic vision was a combination of new models glued to Vietnamese cultural traditions. Diem wanted to rally people with a vision different than communism, but never really endorsed democracy, individual freedoms, or capitalism, which the Americans thought were crucial to fight Marxism. Diem thought they weren't appropriate for the country at this stage, especially with a ruthless enemy. His detractors said he only put in place a family dictatorship. He was convinced of a need for strong leadership to lead the country beyond factions. It became authoritarianism, and intrigues led to his downfall. In 1954, meanwhile, he had much work to do. The Geneva Accord could only delay the conflict, which would be between independent Vietnamese. The North was more stable and centralized, while the South was composed of diverging groups which did not really accept the central government. The South had to create a state and needed time and tools, while the North had a substantial advantage there and was right to expect a quick victory. Once named Prime Minister, Diem immediately wanted to remove the remaining French interference. The country was in ruins, French businesses were leaving, and political and military administrations were devastated. The National Army wasn't really won. Many officers were loyal to France, and services like the police were at the hands of the Binh Xuyen gang. Diem was respected, but few expected him to get over these obstacles. Diem, like past emperors, centralized power and did not often delegate, but mostly because there were few he could trust. He gave his 4 brothers posts, notably Nhu, who was advisor and responsible for the secret police. Diem first needed to gain control of the military, which was still under French control, and in June 1954 had 219,000 men. The army was poorly trained and motivated, but remained essential. It had at its head General Hinh, a French citizen who wanted to block Diem. He was removed from office and threatened Diem with a coup d'etat. Realizing the Americans supported the PM, he left the country for France. Many educated elites didn't like Diem, in large part because he redistributed lands that the French gave them for their support. These elites, who often talked English, had the disproportionate access to Western visitors and gave a false image of things. The Americans became divided between those who wanted to implement the American model and those who respected the PM in the local context. President Eisenhower also decided to reinforce the local army by sending General Collins. Collins began to admire Diem's qualities, but continued wanting to educate him to liberalize his government. This tendency in American representatives led Diem to seldom listen to them. The Geneva Accord set a time period in which the north-south border would be open and people could go from one part to another. Saigon hoped to attract anti-communists and fill the population gap. They made propaganda to attract people, especially Catholics, while Hanoi also made its own propaganda, notably by saying that American sailors were eating babies of those who left the north. 1 million people, mostly Catholics, left for the south, and several hundreds of thousands were blocked by communist forces. The southern government settled them mostly in the Mekong Delta region, fertile and relatively unpopulated, and built dikes for agriculture. As Lam Quang, a future lieutenant general, said, "I hope that the Americans would step in to stop communist expansion in Asia in accordance with the US policy of containment." Further, the French departure would mean true independence for our country. With the help of the Americans, we would have a good cause to fight for. In 1955, Diem began by sending soldiers to remove the Binh Xuyen criminal gang, which controlled parts of Saigon and allied itself with Bao Dai to lead a coup d'etat against Diem. The French, still in place, even put troops to prevent the destruction of the gang. The French didn't like Diem and wanted to keep an influence. The Americans, though, pressured them to stay out of this. The PM continued his consolidation by convincing the Cao Dai sect to join his side. He then turned to the Hoa Ho sect, which had declared war against the government, but which was easily beaten by General Dong Van Minh, nicknamed Big Min. All this seems easy because I'm going quickly over this, but nothing was guaranteed. France finally left military power to Diem, and the army was named ARVN. The PM declared the First Republic of Vietnam on October 26, 1955, after winning a national referendum which elected him head of state and deposed Bao Dai. The only real threat to the government now was the communists. The new president had created a unified country, had integrated 1 million refugees, and created a republic. He would quickly act as an authoritarian leader though, and there would be favoritism for Catholics and members of his Can Lao party. In North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh reverted to 1945 methods and told non-communist groups to dissolve or submit. Rebel tribes were subdued, medias were censored, arts had to promote communism, Hanoi residents had to participate in political education classes twice a day, and teachers were replaced by party cadres. Religion was discouraged and religious leaders were dismissed. The government was promoting China and Chinese writing. The Chinese built important infrastructure and, in violation of the Geneva Accord, provided large quantities of armament. Because of land collectivization reforms and the massive famine that ensued, China and the USSR had to provide North Vietnam with food. There was no direct campaign planned against the South, only low-level subversion to begin with. After Geneva, several thousand Southern communists were told to stay in place, bury their weapons, and do political subversion like infiltrating organizations and establishing anti-government groups. The next question was the 1956 reunification elections planned by the Geneva Accords. Saigon and Washington were determined not to implement these elections, as the North had more population, controlled the votes, and would surely win. Hanoi knew very well there wouldn't be elections. In any case, for Hanoi and Saigon, elections were propaganda tools to convince the West of their legitimacy. For the Vietnamese, legitimacy came from military or civil strength, not free elections or international law. Diem refused the elections, stating that Saigon never signed the Geneva Accord. In 1956, there were changes to the communist side. In February, Khrushchev announced a new Soviet orientation, dissociating himself from Stalinism and direct confrontation. To avoid a nuclear apocalypse, he talked about peace between the powers. He told Hanoi not to directly attack the South but to help South Vietnamese people to rise. Ho Chi Minh disagreed and dissociated from the Soviet leadership. He turned more and more to China and agreed they needed military means to overthrow Diem. While the South Vietnamese army was diminishing, the North Vietnamese army was growing. In the north, 32,000 people died because of the land distribution program, and Hanoi realized it shouldn't blindly follow China. The country remained a strict dictatorship, with critics often sent to forced labor camps to make them learn that art and literature should come from the masses. In November 1956, several thousands of peasants with tools marched to a regional capital and chanted anti-communist slogans. A regular army division was dispatched and annihilated them. The next step was industrialization, because Marxism said workers were the best revolutionaries. Agricultural collectivization progressed, but Hanoi was surprised to see lower productivity. It had to ration, publish false production statistics, and ask allies for help. At the end of 1956, Hanoi gave orders for reactivating the Communist Party in the South and for the beginning of an armed struggle. In the South, Communist agents organized strikes. The Communists began assassinating government officials. The government arrested 15,000 to 20,000 people in 1956, but most of them were released. Several were killed, several wrongly imprisoned, but numbers were relatively low. With the final French withdrawal in April, the Americans had the complete responsibility for training the military. The South Vietnamese army cruelly lacked equipment and was unable to operate on a scale larger than a battalion. A major accomplishment under Diem was land reform. In the Mekong area, 0.25% of the people owned 40% of the land. By a decree in October, land size was limited, excesses were bought by the government and resold to the farmers without interest. The limit was still too high and Diem lacked financing. A large part of the population was still without property. Urban intellectuals kept criticizing Diem and had the right to do so as long as they did not organize. For the president, democracy meant protection and care for everybody. To satisfy the West, he wanted to show a Western democracy facade with an embassy with no real weight and rigged elections. The insurrection began at the beginning with a few thousand men who weren't always loyal to Hanoi, and early progress was unnoticeable. In 1957, the Viet Cong, as they were called, reported a lack of confidence and gain. Hosts and communist caterers born in the South to revive the operations. 65% of those who went north during the country's division in 1954, often Viet Minh veterans, came back south for the insurrection. In mid-1957, the guerrilla had momentum and recruited by criticizing the government. Terrorism was used to limit government presence in the countryside and intimidate peasants. The Viet Cong spread in the countryside, but Saigon ignored the danger. In the summer of 1958, Hanoi wanted to begin a complete insurrection in the south, but China answered it wasn't time. Hanoi gave permission for more assassinations of representatives, but also school teachers, who tended to be more anti-communist. With aggressive anti-communist campaigns, the government managed to weaken subversion. The Politburo, so the Communist Party leadership in Hanoi, recognized that these campaigns had eradicated most Communist Party members and cadres in the South. Diem received a lot of merit from the Americans, but it hid weaknesses. Despite having got rid of several incompetents, many mediocre officers remained. Militias were in poor shape, and lack of discipline led to abuse against the population. Part of government officials in the countryside were from the French era, as the corruption system. In January 1959, North Vietnamese leaders decided in favor of armed struggle and announced it to the 15th plenum of the party. Ho said it would be part of the world revolution and that imperialism was in decline. The Soviets disapproved, but the Chinese were in favor and promised to send $500 million worth of equipment. Many of the South Vietnamese who went north in 1954 were trained in guerrilla warfare in 1959. To send them south, Hanoi created a transport unit and set up plans for an infiltration route. Infiltrations began in July 1959 with 31 tons transported that year. Violence was set to begin in 1960. The communists at that time had almost no support in the South. In 1960, the communists struck their first blow with a rebellion in the Bentay province. The same month, they mounted their first real assault on an Arvin regiment base in Tay Ninh. On January 26, they used the Tet holiday for a surprise attack, killing 40 soldiers and taking 600 weapons. General Tan Van Don analyzed that this failure was due to poor leadership, in part because the regime placed Canlao loyalists to important positions. Military dissatisfaction led to a poorly planned coup attempt on November 11. The No brothers managed to gain time and rally loyal forces. General Khan, a very able commander and loyal to the president, worked to assemble troops and counter the coup. It profoundly marked the president and the generals. Loyalty was now essential, and some officers were now marginalized. The failed coup also convinced Hanoi to accelerate its plan for creating a National Liberation Front. I won't pronounce that, I'll call it NLF or Viet Cong. During the Third Party Congress in Hanoi, the objective was hiding North Vietnam's role in the war. The Politburo wrote, "We must present the Liberation Front to the public immediately, without waiting to determine the personalities who will make it up. The weakness of our movement in South Vietnam over the past several years has been that we have not been able to attract widespread support of the anti-Diem elements among the upper classes, that we have not been able to form a united front with elements opposed to the US and Diem, and that we have not had a name to use in public to appeal to the population, and to use in our strategy to sow division and isolate Diem. This is a favorable opportunity for us to correct that weakness in our movement by forming the Liberation Front for South Vietnam." Assassinations largely rose, with 150 per month, and southern militias were not well armed or led and couldn't maintain security. Saigon's forces were in villages during the day, and the Viet Cong came at night to establish its presence, redistribute land, and collect taxes. Cadres mostly recruited teenagers, more inclined to join. Many peasants supported or joined the Viet Cong. Most didn't understand political development or factions, and few were attracted by ideology. Party directives were to lie on communist tenets because, as Lenin said, peasants are like the bourgeois, they only think about themselves, so they would refuse collectivization. Violence against the reluctant was a factor for explaining collaboration, but mostly the Vietnamese traditionally tend to follow the strong. Many witnesses said to have joined the front because it was strong. The Viet Cong benefited from a charismatic leadership which treated people with apparent kindness and excelled at propaganda. Authority remained in Hanoi. The Front's manifesto talked about freedom against Diem's dictatorship without mentioning communism. This propaganda worked better than anticipated in the West, and many believed that the NLF was actually an independent opposition coalition, so that made a lot of party cadres smile. At the end of the year, Hanoi decided to create a new infiltration route, this time across Laos. It wasn't ideal with the terrain's difficulties, the risk of opposition by Laotians and Americans, but there was an urgent need. Laos was a country with 2 million inhabitants and very few transport infrastructure. Thick jungle covered the territory, facilitating infiltration, and the south would have much more border to protect. I cannot stress enough how important this route through Laos was. It was one of the most important factors for the war's outcome. The Geneva Accord talked about pulling foreign troops out of Laos, but the Laotian Pathet Lao communists were advised by North Vietnamese and Chinese. The United States supported the Laotian right and to an extent the centrists, who sometimes cooperated with the communists. Hanoi used troops to attack the rightists and establish the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Laotians in general honor the warrior people, and North Vietnamese attacks decimated them. The rightist General Phu My decided to retake the capital Vientiane, and despite emergency North Vietnamese aid as well as Chinese and Soviet material aid to the communists and neutralists, he succeeded. The Hanoi Pathet Lao Neutralist Coalition continued to fight and took other territories. The situation was critical, but President Eisenhower only had a few days left in his presidency, so he decided to leave the decision to his successor. John Kennedy came in power in 1961. He admired Diem in his crisis management. This opinion would change, but he remained to his death convinced of the need to defend South Vietnam. The International Control Commission, supervising the 1954 Accords implementation, said that the North was conducting subversion and clandestine aggression against the South. Hanoi officially denied its implication, but at the same time it proclaimed to be the Great Rear, while the South was the Great Frontline. Kennedy thus saw the conflict in a Cold War optic. Criticizing Eisenhower's propensity to use nuclear deterrence as a threat, the new president spoke of flexible response, a concept brought by General Maxwell Taylor, and according to which the US had to be prepared to all types of conflict to avoid a nuclear war. This implied expanding conventional and non-conventional forces. Kennedy was a follower of counterinsurgency, but thought it was more about commando raids instead of a long process with local population. Counterinsurgency gained in popularity as Khrushchev said the USSR would encourage national liberation wars across the world. The young president favored intelligent and vigorous people rather than men with accumulated experience. His defense secretary, Robert McNamara, was a businessman with an excellent memory and analysis capability and was mostly good in statistics. He named McGeorge Bundy, an academic maybe even brother, as advisor. Dean Rusk, who had more experience, was named Secretary of State. Those three men would be the president's main national security advisors for the next 6 years. Rather than adopting a grand strategy for world affairs, Kennedy wanted to go case by case. McNamara and his whiz kids wanted to remodel the Pentagon to impose their economic and statistic rigor like in a private company. They thought their intelligence and economic capabilities made them better at military decisions than career officers' experience. In early 1961 in South Vietnam, the No brothers mixed British counterinsurgency in Malaya, Israeli kibbutz, and French pacification to establish strategic hamlets. Rural community would be reinforced to defend against the NLF. New was the architect and supervisor of this program. It was also about helping the rural modernization policy. They wanted to complete this program in late 1963, but for that they had to force people to work on defenses. Observers condemned forced resettlements, but their program was a success in much of the country. Despite imperfections in pacification, communist efforts weren't better, with forced labor to develop bases, taxation, conscripting the youth, forced marriage, and terrorism. What made the NLF's method efficient was coordination between military attacks and political struggle. The South Vietnamese in 1961 were winning victories, particularly against large communist formations, but still suffered from poor organization, leadership, and coordination. On the other side, Hanoi recognized that the southern government and its army were far from crumbling. Le Duan gave the order to focus on destroying enemy forces. Kennedy's biggest worry in 1961 was Laos. The North Vietnamese had 12,000 men there, and their coalition was gaining ground. During the presidential transition, Eisenhower told Kennedy that Laos was extremely important to the region. As the communists announced on May 3rd they were open to international negotiations, Kennedy jumped on the occasion. He wanted to negotiate the communist withdrawal from certain regions, which was of course out of the question for them. The communists were negotiating because they already controlled the necessary areas for the Ho Chi Minh Trail. At the same time he backed off in Laos, Kennedy adopted a stronger stance on Vietnam. After getting humiliated with the Bay of Pigs failure and at a meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna, Kennedy wanted to prove his mettle. He authorized expanding the number of advisors for the first time since 1956 in violation of Geneva. In the south, the situation worsened in the summer with murder, sabotage, and the fall of several towns near Saigon. Ho Vin's defenders were decapitated and their heads were placed on pikes. Diem decreed the state of emergency. The Viet Cong multiplied its forces and equipments and launched an offensive in September. It started well with the takeover of a provincial capital. The province chief Nguyen Minh Man, considered one of the best, was disemboweled in public and his wife was shot. Ambassador Nolting urged Washington to block the infiltrations. McNamara and the Joint Chief of Staff agreed to send troops, but the diplomat Avril Harriman was completely opposed, saying the Soviets would prevent Hanoi from continuing, which was wrong. Kennedy nevertheless followed his advice. Harriman, by the way, was a high diplomat famous for his role during World War II, and in the case of Vietnam he was condescending with his colleagues and told them he could solve everything through negotiations, and every single time he was wrong. In exchange for aid, the American administration asked Diem for a list of reforms to implement and even to have a say in domestic affairs. Diem didn't want to become a protectorate and managed to make Washington back off on this. The Kennedy administration feared the domino theory and believed with reason that China and North Vietnam were working together to make the dominoes fall. At the time, Hanoi remained closer to Beijing than to Moscow, particularly with ideological divergence. China coordinated communist parties in the region, notably in Thailand, Burma, Laos and Cambodia, and had training camps for them. A hard US stance in South Vietnam prevented an insurgency in Thailand. Historically, Thailand sided with the most threatening side, so siding with the communists would have threatened Malaya and Singapore, where subversive communist parties already operated. The Malaya insurgency from 1948 to 1960 failed in large part because it was isolated. The country didn't share a border with a communist country. The Malays gave much importance to the American defense of Vietnam. Indonesia, meanwhile, was in an essential strategic position. Its Communist Party was the third largest in the world, and its president Sukarno was getting closer to the communist side. As other countries in the region, it would have aligned itself with the tendency in the region. Burma fought the communists for years, but shared a border with China. At the end of 1961, there were 2,600 American advisors in the south, and General Paul Harkins was named their commander. In early 1962, Kennedy wanted to hide the extent of Americans' involvement in Vietnam. He denied that advisors took part in combat. US journalists were critical of Nolting and Harkins, who did their job and didn't spend time to socialize with journalists. Criticism of them by the American press had a particularly negative effect in a country like Vietnam. Journalists in Saigon didn't try to meet other US representatives and mainly stayed between themselves. The South Vietnamese government often invented stories instead of telling the truth, and the more the journalists criticized, the more Saigon hid. Some journalists came to see Diem and US representatives as adversaries, and to report fake stories emanating from urban intellectuals opposed to the president. The situation in early 1962 wasn't ideal, with large futile operations. The Viet Cong now included 20 to 25,000 members. The tendency changed in spring. The military performance was improving, with more emphasis on small units and night operations, and quicker response time. With these successes, villagers were more inclined to help the government and provide information. Reasons for the improvement included helicopters to transport and escort troops, armored vehicles, radios, a rise in advisors from 2,600 to 11,500 who led by example and shared the risks, and finally an improvement in military and administrative leadership. Strategic hamlets were being progressively implemented. They were defended by fences, cleared vegetation, other physical defenses, and now by government representatives who stayed day and night and who usually had family there to defend. Government cadres now generally came to help, as the Viet Cong cadres did, but better. Hanoi decreed that destroying the hamlets was its priority. The Politburo feared that victory was escaping. Le Duan, very militant, wanted to keep the prolonged war but with low intensity to not attract a direct American involvement. He hoped to provoke negotiations like for Laos and then take control of the government by infiltration. The US Joint Chiefs, the CIA, Diem and Thailand asked Kennedy to defend Laos and help Phu My, but the president refused. Immediately in reaction, the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese troops violated the ceasefire and attacked. China and the Soviet Union helped with logistics. The Royalist Army was pushed back. Many in the US were urging for strong measures, and Eisenhower said the loss of Laos would lead to losing the region. Kennedy worked for a second agreement in July which froze the situation, and North Vietnam's pledge to withdraw, which they didn't respect. The Pathet Lao prevented International Control Commission representatives from reaching its areas, which included the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Infiltration by the trail didn't slow down, reaching 10,000 men at the end of the year and including heavy weapons. It's ironic that communists in South Vietnam were so dependent on infiltrations from the north, yet South Vietnam was accused of being a non-viable state because it was dependent on the United States. Already on July 20, South Vietnamese forces demonstrated their more aggressive posture by conducting an airborne attack by night and inflicting a defeat on the communists. With repeated defeats, the Viet Cong were cutting on large operations, and populations were more inclined to cooperate with Saigon. Enthusiasm was spreading, but the US press would intensify its hostility, particularly with David Halberstam's arrival. Him and Neil Sheehan were two young correspondents without experience who thought they had the right to every information and couldn't take no for an answer. They tended to see things in black and white. At the beginning, they supported US policy for supporting the South and didn't want to undermine military efforts. Halberstam was from the New York Times, the most influential media at the time, and became close to John Paul Vann, a US military advisor seeking glory. Vann gave ample information and criticized the same things as the journalists. He was attached to the 7th RVN Division, which was very successful at the time. US journalists spent a lot of time with this division because it was close to Saigon, so they didn't have to go too far. It suffered a defeat in October, after which Diem told his talentful commander Cao to avoid losses. Vann said that because of this, Cao conducted empty operations and avoided the enemy. Halberstam repeated this story and generalized it to the rest of RVN forces. Other journalists like Richard Trugaskis, Kenneth Crawford, Margaret Higgins, Joseph Alsop, and Harold Martin went to visit other units in the country, and they had a much better view of the situation and reported more positive news. 1963 began well for the South but would end catastrophically. It's easily one of the most important years of the war. At the beginning, American equipment shipments since 1962 allowed for the creation of motorized units that inflicted defeat on the communists. Helicopters allowed mobility greater than the enemy. In reaction, communist commanders decided to stop running after first contact and establish fortified positions to ambush RVN forces and win propaganda victories. we now get to the Battle of Abbac on January 2, which was presented by journalists as an enormous failure and proof of South Vietnamese military incompetence, but reality was more complex. Intelligence reported an enemy force of 120 men in Abbac, so they sent a much larger force totaling about 1,000 men against them. In reality, the communists were 400 strong and solidly entrenched. Because of Diem's policies, there was no command unity, and province chiefs have some authority on military units. Colonel Dam was unable to command under pressure from new developments, and Van, who accompanied him, added to the stress. Southern forces were trained to fight guerrilla, so by fighting in small, isolated, flexible groups, but suddenly they were facing an entrenched and perfectly hidden enemy. Van chose a landing zone for reinforcement helicopters, but didn't notice the enemy right near that spot, which led to disaster. The helicopters were under heavy fire and soldiers who got off were massacred, with 5 destroyed aircraft. M113 armored carriers were supposed to arrive, but took too much time, and when they arrived, they didn't know where to shoot. The enemy was well hidden, and their fire struck the exposed M113 gunners with precision. The M113s did exactly what they were told to do in training by the Americans, so attacking in small groups for flexibility, but that meant the enemy could concentrate their fire. General Cao was sent to take control of the situation and restored calm, seeing that everything was a negative. He had ordered to minimize casualties and missed an opportunity to crush the communists. Van wanted more aggressive tactics with coordinated frontal assaults, but Cao wanted to intensify air and artillery support and wait for reinforcements. Some accused the South Vietnamese of fearing losses, but it was more a tactical adjustment in front of heavy casualties. This would exactly be what the Americans would do beginning in 1965, using firepower to minimize casualties. Before air support could arrive, the Viet Cong had escaped. It was a relative tactical failure, the communists having suffered larger losses in proportion but smaller in absolute. While American media talked about the South Vietnamese defeat, the Viet Cong said it was a resplendent victory and a symbol of success. RVN soldiers generally performed well, but divided command was problematic. Hanoi was ready to pay the price in blood, but not Saigon. There was a need for more training, because establishing an army is a long process. Van gave journalists like Halberstam and Sheehan an account of the battle which placed the entire blame on the South Vietnamese, talking about a miserable performance and saying that they never listened to his advice. He blamed them for not getting over the difficulties caused by his own mistakes. He completely lied by saying he wasn't the one who chose the landing zone and committed the biggest mistake of the battle. The journalist swallowed that. Sheehan wrote that the South Vietnamese lacked aggressivity. Halberstam said it revealed the political system which made officers only focus on promotion. For Van and his journalist friends, the most important area in South Vietnam was the Mekong Delta, where the government had the most trouble. The Mekong was in reality the least important area. It was practical for the Viet Cong for low-intensity guerrilla operations and supplied recruits and food, but couldn't be used as a base for major operations. In the spring and summer of 1963, the situation in the countryside was still improving. During the first half of the year, the Viet Cong only attempted 7 battalion-sized attacks compared to 35 for the previous year. Hamlets were still working, even though only part was implemented due to the lack of funding. Guerrilla experts such as Ted Sarong and Robert Thompson found the program and the war effort in general remarkable. What mostly worried American experts was the infiltrations, and even then their estimates undervalued the number of men infiltrated by a factor of 3. Hanoi later admitted having infiltrated by land over 165,000 weapons from 1961 to 1963, more than by sea. Infiltrated men were much better in combat than recruits. The situation in Laos was worsening, with offensives by the Pathet Lao in the North Vietnamese in April. Kennedy refused a land intervention but authorized limited airstrikes. 1963 seemed to be an improvement, with much less attack than the previous year. The RVN was gaining experience, and the guerrillas were demoralized. Unexpected events came to help the communists. Religious tensions suddenly burst out in Hue. Diem had put his brother, Ngo Dinh Thuc, in 1960 as the city's archbishop, and Thuc showed a derogatory attitude towards the Buddhists. It burst out in May, when after a Catholic celebration honoring Thuc, Diem banned the display of non-government flags, ironically to avoid religious tension. It didn't go well because shortly after, some Buddhists displayed flags which were removed by the police. The militant monk Quang said it was religious persecution, and hundreds of people demonstrated. Local authorities failed to disperse the crowd. Soldiers were sent, and then an explosion of controversial origin in the crowd killed several people. Reacting, the soldiers opened fire. There were 9 dead and 14 wounded. Most authors on this say the Buddhists were only reacting to Catholic repression, but they had other specific reasons. Journalists believe stories from Saigon intellectuals without noticing their political agendas. 2 of the sources cited, Pham Ngoc Thao and Pham Xuan An, were communist agents. Journalists said that 80% of Vietnamese were Buddhists, and thus alienating them was alienating the majority. In reality, of 15 million people, 3 to 4 million were Buddhists, and only part of them were practicing. Most Buddhists were in the countryside and knew nothing of troubles in Saigon and Hue. Among Diem's 18 ministers, 5 were Catholics, 5 Confucians, and 8 Buddhists, including the Vice President and the Foreign Affairs Minister. Since the 1990s, Hanoi openly admitted its involvement in organizing demonstrations. It had many agents in low and mid levels, but it was uncertain for high levels. Quang has often been accused of being a communist, but it was never confirmed. Under American pressure, Diem offered concessions to the Buddhists in June, but it didn't work. In organized fashion and after having noticed the journalists, the monk Thich Quang Duc publicly set himself on fire. This picture by Malcolm Brown went around the world and was often the first picture people saw of South Vietnam. Other monks there had speakers and declared it was because of the government's refusal to accept their demands, thus omitting the negotiations in progress. There were troubles like that all summer. American Ambassador Nolting was replaced by Henry Cabot Lodge in August. Lodge loved making decisions by himself, didn't do much of Asia, and was a Republican Party liberal who was for remodeling countries to America's image. Halberstam wrote that the situation was ready for a coup d'etat and that Americans wanted a change in government, which was false. Several Southern officials were dissatisfied with Diem's crisis management, but because they judged him too soft. 10 high-placed generals, most of them Buddhists and including those who would lead the coup later, met on August 18 and said Diem had let demonstrations go for too long and that it would threaten the war effort. Halberstam added to it by writing that the Vietnamese were waiting for the Americans to show Diem he had to leave. He said that Diem lost all popularity and that General Minh was a great alternative. South Vietnamese generals could not conceive that these media attacks in the New York Times and other media sources did not represent Kennedy's position. As the army was raiding temples in Hue, Quang left the city for Saigon to coordinate demonstrations and get closer to journalists and diplomats. Several other monks set themselves on fire, and in August, the US pressured Saigon for concessions. If Diem wanted an agreement, Nhu took the hard line. The army mostly wanted to concentrate on fighting the communists. Nhu decided to use martial law to destroy the contestation movement, and on the 21st, the police assaulted militant pagodas without capturing Quang. The American government said it was an impending disaster and sent Ambassador Lodge a message telling him that Diem should get rid of his brother, saying, Diem must be given the chance to rid himself of Nhu and his coterie and replace them with the best military and political personalities available. If, in spite of all your efforts, Diem remains obdurate and refuses, then we must face the possibility that Diem himself cannot be preserved. Lodge hated Diem and took that as a green light to conspire and overthrow him. It's often been said that the military situation in 1963 was bad because of Diem, but in reality, until his death it was good. On September 9, the 7th Division demolished the Viet Cong units which had participated in Hap Bac. The VC intensified its operations in the summer in the Mekong, an area close to Saigon and thus the journalists, but countrywide the tendency didn't change. Communist sources found strategic hamlets efficient until November the 1st. Some blame the US for the coup, and indeed, Lodge, many journalists, members of the State Department conspired to get rid of him against orders from President Kennedy, who it must be said let them do it, but South Vietnamese generals had their reasons. One was the fear that Diem and Nhu were conspiring with the communists to neutralize the country. They thought it was for them to save the country. American approval boosted their will and gave the impression that the CIA was behind every event and that the coup wouldn't succeed without American support. For many Diem supporters, raids on pagodas were too much. The Foreign Affairs Minister, a Buddhist named Van Mo, resigned. Ton That Dinh, commanding the 3rd Corps, joined the group of plotters centered on Don, Kim, Minh, and Kiem. The coup happened on November the 1st. Diem, discouraged because he couldn't defeat it this time, contacted the generals to get him to the airport, offering to leave. Minh agreed but decided to get Diem and Nhu killed. The generals knew he couldn't stay alive because he was still popular, so both brothers were killed behind an armored carrier. Immediately afterwards, the Washington Post featured "Hope in South Vietnam," and it long has seemed almost impossible to continue with the Diem government any effective resistance to the communist conquest of this part of southern Asia. The New York Times wrote, "The coup in Saigon was inevitable, and given the stubborn refusal of President Diem to institute political reforms that had long been urged upon him, it was by this time highly desirable." Lodge himself was glad and said, "We should not overlook what the coup can mean in the way of shortening the war and enabling Americans to come home." Kennedy reacted with shock and anger. On November 22nd, he was killed himself. Several of his admirers said that he saw Vietnam as futile and wanted to withdraw America's involvement, but proof showed the opposite, and he never told his close advisors Taylor, Rusk, McGeorge Bundy, or his brother Robert that he wanted to leave. The communists, contrarily to the Americans, fully realized the coup's importance. Ho Chi Minh said, "I can scarcely believe the Americans would be so stupid," and the Politburo added, "The consequences of the November 1st coup d'etat will be contrary to the calculations of US imperialists." Diem was one of the strongest individuals resisting the people and communism. Everything that could be done in an attempt to crush the revolution was carried out by Diem. Diem was one of the most competent lackeys of the US imperialists. Among the anti-communists in South Vietnam or exiled in other countries, no one had sufficient political assets and abilities to cause others to obey. Therefore, the Lackey administration cannot be stabilized. The coup d'etat on November 1st, 1963 will not be the last. The communists accepted this gift they were unable to achieve in 9 years. Hanoi readjusted its strategy to capitalize in December during the party's Central Committee's 9th conference. They set up preparations for larger operations, which is the reason why in the immediate aftermath of the coup the Viet Cong were less active. Several hamlets, including near Saigon, were captured. The new military government suddenly faced a renewal in religious and political factionalism, with each group wanting to gain power at the expense of others. The 4 years between Diem's First Republic and Thieu's Second Republic were marked by civil discord, failed management experiences, declining economic conditions, and a rapid expansion of the war. General Mid led the provisional government for 3 months before being overthrown by General Khan, who had support from Ambassador Lodge. Coup and coup attempts continued in 1964. High-ranking officers were replaced by Khan, and the musical chair game contributed to instability, with different civil and military governments and councils before the Key and Thieu duo came in 1965. The war situation began deteriorating. The junta replaced many government officials because of their loyalty to Diem, including competent provincial administrators and mostly strategic hamlet supervisors. Many militias and hamlets were disarmed. In a few weeks, 9 of the top 20 commanders were replaced. As the Viet Cong launched a new wave of attacks, the government was unable to offer leadership. Militias were abandoning their posts, there were no more aggressive patrols, and the communists quickly capitalized. The government's influence in villages started to evaporate. On the other hand, Halberstam, Sheehan, and others were suddenly writing very optimistic articles on the situation. A report by CIA experts, confirmed by communist sources, confirmed that November the 1st was the turning point for hamlets. In many regions, the military efforts disintegration only began in 1964, as the communists had to get back up from their defeats in the first 10 months of 1963. Vice President Johnson succeeded Kennedy as President of the United States. Lyndon Johnson was a senator, very able to push colleagues to adopt legislation. He wasn't very interested in international matters. His focus was always on domestic programs. As we'll see, he would always want to play down the actions in Vietnam in order to focus attention on domestic issues. Under his administration, deliberations were always between his close advisors. Johnson approved Kennedy's policy, and by taking power after an admired martyr, he couldn't suddenly change it. He kept most of his predecessor's team. His 3 main advisors would be McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, and Rusk. LBJ informed Lodge there would be no question of remodeling South Vietnam in America's way. The administration mostly thought in terms of domino theory and power distribution in Asia. For them, the most important domino was Indonesia with its 100 million inhabitants and its capital strategic position for maritime transport. Its leader, Sukarno, was getting closer to China and the Indonesian Communist Party. He recognized North Vietnam, broke off relations with the South, and talked positively about the communist reunification. At the beginning of 1964, the South's political and military situation was deteriorating so much that General Nguyen Khan overthrew the junta on January 30 with help from General Kim. Khan established a very diverse but inexperienced cabinet. Gradually, Laos began to understand South Vietnamese realities and sent in Jude that to succeed, Saigon should establish a more authoritarian state. The Quang, contrarily to other Buddhist militants, remained a sworn enemy of the government, and with every concession he asked for more. Even Lodge ended up saying Saigon should refuse his demands. In North Vietnam, there was also a transition, but much more stable. Ho Chi Minh's health was declining, and Le Duan was dominant in the Politburo. Le Duan was for closer ties with China and stricter adherence to Chinese Communist ideology. He strongly criticized the Soviets for pacific coexistence, as he called it, and opposed Yap and Tonkin, who were more on the Soviet side. Yap kept his place as defense minister, but General Tan would take charge of the war in the south. Le Duan and Tan wanted larger battles to destroy the RVN and said that armament matters were secondary. The Viet Cong would be reinforced by recruitment, but mostly by infiltrations. By 1964, most infiltrators were born in the north. Yap warned that too rapid an increase in operations could provoke the Americans. Mao meanwhile agreed for decisive battles. For this new strategy, the North Vietnamese transformed the Ho Chi Minh Trail into a truck lane. They would send in 1964 4 times more supplies than the last year. The Communists were restarting their offensive in Laos too, but President Johnson didn't want to answer. The Americans didn't pay much attention to seaborne infiltration, which was increasing. Heavy equipment was easier to transport by boat. Cargo was sent to the South Vietnamese or Cambodian coast, with the Cambodian government collaborating. The South Vietnamese Navy was particularly weakened since the coup and had an inept leadership. 3,600 tons of equipment came by the sea in 1964 and had a large impact on the war. The Viet Cong now had AK-47s, rocket launchers, and other modern equipments. At the end of the year, practically all units were equipped and had superior firepower against RVN soldiers. Contrarily to popular myth, the Viet Cong got less than 10% of its weapons by capture from 1960 to 1965. As Hanoi said, and as General Samuel Williams recognized in the 50s and was criticized for, the key to destroy South Vietnam was to destroy its conventional forces. Infiltrated men from the north were directed now to do terrorist acts against the Americans and their installations. There were attacks against bars, sports matches, and theaters. An American ship was even sunk in the port of Saigon on May 2nd by commandos. The largest confrontation of the war happened on April 12 with a communist battalion taking Kien Long before disemboweling the district chief and shooting his wife. The situation was not entirely bad, with for example Colonel T from the 7th Division, who by the way came first in a class of 300 in a staff officer military formation in the US. He beat the Viet Cong at Dak Bac, but there was no media coverage this time. There was another success at the end of the year at Kien Hoa on the coast. There were feats of heroism, notably by American advisors who won medals, contrarily to Neil Sheehan's claims in A Bright Shiny Lie, saying it was a war without heroes. During the battle at Nam Dong on July 6, Sergeant Terence Terran lost use of his arm but kept firing his AR-15 from the hip, leading to a Silver Star. Captain Donlon directed the defense effort, running from one place to another to coordinate, killing enemies and throwing back enemy grenades. He pulled a wounded sergeant and equipment to the rear under heavy fire, all while getting wounded 4 times separately, including shrapnel in the stomach. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor, the first in the war. With the events in the summer of 1964 in favor of the Communists, Washington criticized Saigon for focusing too much on military aspects and not enough on political and economic aspects. The Americans did not understand that to gain popular support and build programs, you first needed security, and that problems were mostly due to poor leadership. For the Americans, South Vietnam's inability to progress led to initiating clandestine programs in the north, including psychological warfare and sabotage. Johnson and his advisors didn't want to create a large guerrilla movement in the north as they feared a Chinese reaction. Naval commando raids had more success, but at a great cost. The US Chiefs of Staff as well as the CIA recommended land and airstrikes in Laos and North Vietnam, but the Johnson team rejected everything. They didn't want to attract attention on the conflict before the elections and risk losing votes. His civilian advisors believed the insurgency was self-sufficient, underestimated the potential of these measures, and focused on their counterinsurgency theories. They feared the Chinese reaction and the possibility of nuclear war. They were haunted by the specter of a new Korea. Self-imposed restrictions were promoted by civilian advisors because of their attraction to limited war theories. The theorist Thomas Schelling wrote in Strategy of Conflict that opponents in a conflict are rational and can be restrained by limited actions which made an escalation against their interests. Quang was frustrated by the American refusal for strong actions and openly talked about actions in the north, especially since northern soldiers were among the Viet Cong. In July, Lodge was replaced by Maxwell Taylor as ambassador. The communists in the south were preparing for large-scale operations in conventional battles. Hanoi thought it could win in 1965 for several reasons. They thought that the Americans would not send troops, that the Arvin was already stretched, that a communist victory would demoralize Saigon, and that the Americans would not bomb north of the 17th parallel by fear of a Chinese intervention. It was true the South was in a bad fix, but Hanoi miscalculated their unpredictable American will. Gulf of Tonkin incident is one of the most controversial of the war. We often hear that it was a lie, even a conspiracy, and that it was an excuse for the Americans to enter the war. All of these assertions are wrong. In early August, the USS Maddox was in a reconnaissance patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin for a De Soto mission, so for deciphering North Vietnamese communications and radar emissions. The North Vietnamese were following the Maddox for days before the South Vietnamese raised and feared they would come to bomb the coast. In the leadership conference, Ho and Giap wanted to wait for an attack to respond, especially since the ship was in international waters, but Le Duan decided to attack. The Americans intercepted communications, and the Maddox prepared itself on August 2nd by distancing itself from the North Vietnamese coast. Communist torpedo boats caught up with it and attempted an ill-conceived attack before withdrawing in front of American firepower. The South Vietnamese PM Can told the Americans to respond so as not to look like a paper tiger, and Taylor agreed. Johnson refused, saying it was probably a case of a local commander taking initiative, and decided instead to reinforce the Maddox with the Turner Joy. On the evening of August 4, the Maddox received deciphered messages talking about an imminent naval attack, and an hour later, the ship's radars detected what seemed to be incoming boats. It was a dark night with low visibility. Planes were dispatched, and both ships fired in the direction of the radar targets. For several hours, contact appeared and disappeared, and the radars indicated direct hits on the enemies. Several crew members reported seeing enemy boats, enemy fire, as well as torpedo wakes during the incident. In what seemed to be a proof of the attacks, the Americans intercepted the North Vietnamese message saying that they had downed 2 American planes and had sacrificed 2 of their boats. With those indications, Admiral Sharp, Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific, determined that the attack happened. It's only after the immediate US response that indications emerged to doubt the event. Nobody found irrefutable proof, and proofs indicate that the North Vietnamese message was talking about the August 2 attack and that the August 4 attack did not happen. At the time, Johnson and his 3 advisors decided to respond. In the spirit of Schelling's theories, Rusk was for sending a signal that the Americans wouldn't back off but didn't want a war in the north. Johnson ordered airstrikes on naval bases. The evening of August 4 in the US, the President called the leaders of Congress to initiate a resolution giving him war powers in Asia. In Operation Pierce Arrow, American naval aviation bombed naval bases in the north, but 2 planes were downed. The South Vietnamese wanted more, and the Thais and Malays were in favor of airstrikes. Johnson thought he already had necessary powers for the war, and the resolution's objective was to give an image of political unity. In testimonies before Congress, government representatives did not mention that the ships were spying, nor that the South Vietnamese were conducting commando raids on northern shores. Before the incident, the Americans disapproved the president's Vietnam policy at 58%, but after, they approved it at 72% and were for military action against North Vietnam at 50% for and 25% against. The Southeast Asia Resolution, also called Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed 98-2 in the Senate and 416-0 in the House. So in retrospective, there were 2 attacks, one real attack which even the North Vietnamese later confirmed, and a second attack which most likely did not happen, but many witnesses were convinced it did happen even years after the event. We cannot talk here about a fabrication nor a lie. McNamara later said the second one probably did not happen, but many crew members involved were convinced it did. The Johnson administration responded with the information it had. Then, some say that the United States entered the war because of that. As we saw, they were progressively involved for years prior, and it was never a major factor. Gulf of Tonkin wasn't a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11. Even after that in the resolution, Johnson was still wavering in his actions and only agreed to send troops when American bases in Vietnam were hit in March 1965, 6 months after the event. Some say that Congress had been manipulated and didn't want to give so much power to the president, but in following years, Congress approved the president's policy. Later, on August 18, 1967, the president repudiated the resolution as a legal base for the war and said the authority came from Article 2 of their Constitution as Commander-in-Chief. The resolution was cancelled by Congress in May 1970, but it didn't stop the war. At the end of 1964, Ambassador Taylor, Admiral Sharp, and General Westmoreland, who had succeeded Harkins in June at the head of the MACV, the American military mission in Vietnam, were all for striking the Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam, send troops to protect air bases, and intensify naval patrols. General Johnson, at the head of the army, was even in favor of troops in Laos. The president's advisors convinced him of the opposite. Johnson cancelled DeSoto patrols and South Vietnamese commando raids. The president was worried that if the military recommendations became public, he would be pressured to implement them. He ordered the Pentagon to lie and say the officers did not recommend actions like these. Johnson, Taylor, and McNamara believed they could wait several months before taking strong measures, and didn't know the enemy wanted to begin major operations shortly. In South Vietnam, the militant Buddhist Quang said that the PM Quang was a stooge of the Catholics, and Catholic establishments like churches, a school, and stores were destroyed, with dead. Quang didn't want to suppress the riots, fearing the same fate as Diem, and agreed to their demands. In Vietnam, to look soft like that is the worst thing you can do. Some protesters were communist infiltrators. Militant Buddhists gave him a new list of preposterous demands. Quang agreed nevertheless, leading to only more demands. On August 27, the generals openly criticized the PM, and this led to a triumvirate by interim with Kiem and Minh. The Politburo took advantage of that to send Cosvian a directive to dramatically increase political struggle, including with intellectuals and notables, and bring in a peace movement. China didn't want to be caught in Vietnam like in Korea. Mao told Hanoi that China wouldn't intervene and advised to withdraw to the mountains in case of invasion. An invasion of North Vietnam at the time would have been ultimately much better than the situation the Americans were stuck in without invading. The North Vietnamese would have lost their logistics system from the port of Haiphong and would have been dependent on China. After the war, Giap said he greatly feared an American South Vietnamese invasion in 1964 and 1965 and said the Americans could have invaded with only 3 divisions and naval and air units, much less than what they sent later. Johnson had good reasons not to do so before March 1965, when China started again to say it would defend North Vietnam. He hoped the South would hold alone. He also rejected the good option that was cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The area to defend wouldn't have been large compared to South Vietnam's border, and the North Vietnamese depended on trucks. The Americans could have used their firepower fully, as there were no civilians in the area, contrarily to South Vietnam. Communist General Dong Si Nguyen, in charge of the trail during most of the war, said he didn't fear bombings but greatly feared the land intervention, even minor. Hanoi didn't fear an American intervention at the time because of Johnson's overcautiousness, and Ho said that his country scared their US Navy. During the 1964 presidential campaign, Johnson presented himself as a peace candidate and said he wouldn't send troops to Vietnam. Immediately after a speech in Oklahoma where he said he wouldn't send troops, the Politburo conferred from September 25 to 29 and determined it was time to destroy the South Vietnamese military. The Viet Cong wasn't strong enough to win alone, so northern regiments would be sent. The Politburo talked about mobilizing the entire country and ordered the 325th Division to South Vietnam with General Nguyen Chi Tan to command the war effort. He had orders to conquer the South by large-scale combat. There would be no negotiations to end the war unless the US accepted Hanoi's terms and withdrew, toppled the Saigon government, and replaced it with a coalition. This in any case would lead to reunification, and this policy would stay the same until October 1972. On November the 1st, the Viet Cong attacked the Bien Hoa Air Base, where there were American barracks, and killed 4 Americans and wounded 30. Taylor, Westmoreland, and Sharp asked for an immediate response to demonstrate Americans' determination. The JCS called for airstrikes on Laos and North Vietnam, as well as introducing Marines to protect military installations. Johnson was especially concerned about the elections and thought in terms of impact on public opinion. He feared that the response would be perceived as an electoral ploy. His team phoned Lewis Harris from Harris Poll, who said that Americans would approve if the president didn't immediately act. The president and his team gave Taylor an excuse not to intervene. Your Commander-in-Chief, ladies and gentlemen! Critics later said that the Joint Chiefs should have resigned because of the executive's poor decisions, but they probably would have been replaced by yes-men, and it would have produced a crisis in a bad time like MacArthur and Truman for Korea. Noticing the lack of American reaction and Johnson's victory in the elections, Hanoi was confident of intensifying its efforts without serious repercussions. At the same time, tensions between France and the US on NATO gave the idea of a weakened West. In the Soviet Union, Khrushchev was replaced by Brezhnev and Kosygin, who adopted a more aggressive posture and announced they wanted to repair relations with North Vietnam. Zhou Enlai at the same time was preparing with Sukarno's Indonesian government to purge non-socialist elements from the army and start a war with Malaya. In Saigon, Tan Van Huong, a competent nationalist leader, took power in November. At the end of 1964, the Viet Cong had over 52,000 men. Violent fighting happened in the Dinh Dinh province. Respecting the counterinsurgency doctrine, Westmoreland advised the local commanders to break up their forces in smaller units, but the communists just attacked small units piecemeal. Westmoreland's conclusion was that for the rest of the war, he should absolutely not ignore large enemy units. If we wanted to send small units to cover villages, we needed large maneuver forces to counter large enemy units. The largest communist attack of the year happened in Bindia with the equivalent of a division. The communists were well equipped with AK-47s, machine guns, and mortar battalions. Tan wanted to take the hamlet and ambush reinforcements. His forces fought against South Vietnamese Rangers and Marines who were outnumbered, and he had to retire after large losses on both sides. With his big victory in the election, Johnson didn't have to worry about this aspect anymore. He ordered an interdepartmental group to examine options for North Vietnam. As usual, the president ignored the military's recommendations and followed those of his close group of advisors in favor of graduated escalation, which I'll talk about in the next video. He approved a detailed plan with two phases. A first beginning on December 15 with clandestine raids on the north and 2 small air attacks per week on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If the South improves its situation after 30 days, the Americans would begin a bombing program with the option of stopping at any time. Well-known historians like David Kaiser or Fredrik Logevall said that Johnson had decided to bomb the north and introduce troops at the time in 1964, but proofs are weak. In reality, LBJ still contemplated the possibility of backing off. The president did the bare minimum to maintain South Vietnam until June 1965. War plans cited by the two authors were last resort contingency plans. Johnson believed that an American intervention would be long and difficult and didn't want to commit except as last resort to save the South. On December 14, Operation Barrel Roll airstrikes began in Laos with 4 planes twice a week. Fumi and the JCS begged Johnson to go harder, but the administration said the objective was not to inflict damage but to send a signal of determination. It didn't work. On December 24, 2 communist agents detonated a car filled with explosives under a hotel, killing 2 American officers and wounding 38 others, with 25 wounded civilians. Taylor agreed with Admiral Sharp to bomb the north in response, but Rusk and McNamara convinced the president to refuse, saying that with instability in Saigon, perhaps the Viet Cong was not the culprit, even with the abundance of proofs and the NLF's own admission. On January 27, the White House decided for stronger actions in the war and sent McGeorge Bundy to determine which ones. During his visit, the Viet Cong attacked twice by surprise on February 7 in the Pleiku province, killing 7 Americans, wounding more than 100, and damaging or destroying 25 planes. Johnson decided to respond, but chose the weakest of 3 given options, Operation Flaming Dart, so bombing North Vietnamese barracks. And most sorties were cancelled due to bad weather. Bundy recommended a prolonged bombing, which would follow the Viet Cong attack's intensity. The plan, Rolling Thunder, began on March 2 with 1 strike per week. I'll go in detail in the next video over signaling and graduated response, but in short, military measures taken didn't aim for a military objective, but rather to begin slowly and increase the intensity to send Hanoi a message saying, "Watch out! You see what we can do? We can do it harder, so stop what you're doing." Of course, it didn't work because the communists didn't subscribe to the same academic theories. The Johnson administration completely underestimated the importance of physical damage. Only in April, the administration learned about the presence of North Vietnamese units and the communist change in strategy, but even when they knew, the president did not exploit their vulnerabilities. In the first months of 1965, American intelligence still thought the communists would maintain small attacks. After the attacks on US bases, the JCS and Westmoreland were for US troops to protect installations. Johnson's advisors agreed, and the president sent 2 Marine battalions at Da Nang in early March. He didn't see that as a first step of an intervention, but rather as a temporary measure. He was still fearful of a confrontation with communist powers, and feared that the left wing of the Democratic Party would turn against the war when things would go more intense. He thus wanted to downplay these deployments. It was a mistake in the long term because he never really tried to mobilize the American public in the long term, and Americans slowly became aware of his hiding. The Marines had orders not to participate in combat. The NVA 325th Division and other units arrived in the South Central Highlands in early 1965. They established bases and joined the Viet Cong in operations. The war had only just begun. That's all for this first video on the Vietnam War. I hope you liked it because there are months of work behind it. I read several thousand pages of books. I had 48,000 words of notes for this first part only, so just reducing it for the first video was a lot of work. The next one will be about the war's intensification from 1965 to 68, so you can like and subscribe, and I'll see you around.